What I thought I would do is I'm just wanting to highlight a couple of things as we go through the article first. Do feel free, because I can see everybody, that if you want to make a comment or have a question as we go through each section, please feel free to just raise your hand, but there will be time for that also at the end, and for some conversation and sharing of ideas and experiences in terms of listening. I guess that first part of the article begins by asking, well, why listen? And, you know, I guess it's fairly obvious. It's for good communication, good relationships. But I always also remember reading or doing a program many years ago, and the title was The Art of Listening. And I think it's a very good expression, because I think listening isn't something that just happens, but it is a skill, and there is a sense in which there is an art to it, perhaps more so in some contexts than in others, but nonetheless an art. And I think it also, that phrase recognises that listening is not easy. It you would think it is, but it's not. And that gives an example. It gives a couple of examples there, and people may have. I think particularly there are more challenges to listening carefully, to listening deeply, and not just listening to a whole lot of words, because of the nature of the way we communicate these days, which is with technology like we're doing now, and so many social media, texting, emails, the whole range of communication. We have to listen. It's actually much harder. It's not just as simple, perhaps. It's not as simple as it perhaps once was. And also in a culture where everything is very fast and very, very loud. It says, I think, in that second page, and I'll just quote, it's just that as everything about the world speeds up, and as the tsunami of online opinions heats up, and as the urgency to make instant decisions flares up, listening tends to get trampled underfoot. So, but listening, as we know, is just so important. And, you know, we know ourselves when we need to communicate, we want to be listened to. We want to make sure that the other person or persons have actually heard what we're trying to express. And to do that is not easy, as I said. It's hard work. And I think one of the things in the art or the skills is that our listening needs to be intentional and disciplined. And perhaps particularly for those of us in some kind of caring role, when we're trying to support people, that's even more so the case. And so in order to do that, we've got these pillars of great listening. And you may not, don't feel you have to agree with everything in this article or anything. You may find it has some deficiencies, or it may be wrong in some aspects, but it's something to at least to on which we can ground our conversation or base it. I thought the interesting thing when we went through that first pillar, it talked about listening with our bodies as well as our minds. And I must confess, this year, I think, and particularly in our context of pastoral care, that's highlighted by the fact that we don't have that physical aspect in the same way. And it may be something for us to have a think about a little bit more later for our particular context at the moment. But I am aware, and I'm sure we all are, how as a part of communication, how what we're doing with our bodies can have a huge impact on how people think whether we're listening or not. So if you're listening to somebody, they're trying to share something, and at the same time you're looking at your mobile phone or doing other things, or your eyes are going around, we communicate our interest, our involvement, our engagement by how we actually are physically present to the conversation or to the interaction. So I think we need to remember that, even though at the moment it's the question for us will be, is there something else we need to be aware of or do when we don't have that physical context? So, for example, when we're just trying to listen to somebody on the telephone, what difference might that make? I don't have any answer for that. I just raise it as perhaps a question for us to have a look at when we have a discussion. So that was the first point, was if we listen with our bodies as well as our minds. And then it goes on to mention we listen with our thoughts and our feelings. And it goes on to say, just down there, I'll just quote, when you are listening to somebody completely attentively, then you are listening not only to the words, but also to the feeling of what is being conveyed, to the whole of it and not just part of it. So that the words, and not only just the words, but the way somebody is speaking and the emotion that's being expressed can communicate something else that's going on. So I think we need to remember that it's actually this listening, it can be quite complicated at times, because what people are saying at one level and communicating information, there may be something else that they're that's going on underneath, and you can possibly pick that up or sense it by the emotion and stuff that's happening. So it's really important to be aware of those different levels of communication and listening. So tone and emotion are all important. And I suppose that the last bit there, and it's a really good question for us, perhaps, which I'll ask a bit later, is as we take into account both emotion and not just the words, what is it that makes us feel heard? Often it's when people actually pick up those subtexts, those other things, can sense that something else is trying to be expressed, but for whatever reason, perhaps isn't being expressed in words. So how do we deal with that as good listeners is also an important thing to remember. The other thing I thought was interesting in that third point was listening is interactive. It's listening on both sides. It's not just, it's not a kind of a one-way thing where you're just absorbing something. And on the next page, it says, I thought this was really interesting. To a very great extent, listeners shape what they hear. So we have to be attentive. I think what that's saying is we need to be attentive if we want to be good listeners to how we are feeling. And perhaps it says for us, for example, if I'm not in the mood, if I've got something else really going on with me at the moment, it may not be a good time to actually engage in listening. So awareness of yourself and where you're at may be really important to be aware of if you want to listen deeply, because you may have to say, well, and be honest with yourself, this is not a good time. maybe a good time for the person. And I know you can't always orchestrate that. Sometimes somebody will ring you at a time, or you'll be in a conversation where you still have to respond and listen as best you can. But if you're aware of that that aspect, that being a good listener will, to some degree, perhaps to a large degree, depend on how you are, your disposition. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And it may be better in some ways, you know, if I was thinking it may be better to actually share that with somebody. Say, look, it may not be the best time for me to have this conversation, or can we make another time? You might have some other strategies for perhaps how to deal with that. But I think it is an important point. Listeners shape what they hear. I think the other aspect here is to, and it's not an easy thing to do, but as listeners, we kind of have to let go of ourselves. So like I said, we've got to recognise where we are, and if there are times when we can't do that, well, perhaps that's not a good time to be in that situation if it can be avoided. But other times we can say, look, I've got to let myself go and really focus on this other person or persons or situation in order to listen. Otherwise, what's going on in the background for us will influence, overwhelm, shape what we, or can shape or influence what we actually hear. So I think that's a really interesting point. So I like to see it as a sense of being, if we're in a space where we really want to listen, that's being open and kind of to whatever is, and pushing away something of ourselves. But also, interestingly, I think sometimes the history, because what can shape what we hear at any point in time may be the history that we have had with that person or persons. So sometimes coming to a conversation or listening afresh is not always easy to do, and is can be a challenge. And listening is selective. We all know about selective. We can't help that. I think that's a given. And I think that selectiveness, I love the phrase at the end, every one of us has a nonsense index, and we usually dismiss or ignore things that don't seem to be immediate, that don't seem to make immediate sense to us. So that's an interesting point. And I think again, so to a large extent, people do not hear where others are coming from. They hear where they themselves are coming from. And so I think that just reinforces what I said before about that sense. In order to avoid that, you really have to being on the same page as that person as much as possible. There is a real need to let go of yourself as a good listener, as much as we possibly can. And then the fifth one, the last one, it says, of course, hearing and listening are key components of everything that we do and everything that interests us. It's absolutely essential. And it was interesting, it says, made the point that we're surrounded by noise. And I don't know what you think. I'll be interested in your reaction. But in being a good listener, perhaps we need to experience silence in order to be able to listen carefully. And it raises the other question, of course, in being a good listener, how we respond can be critical. And sometimes, how do we deal with silence in that? Is silence appropriate? Is silence helpful, or is it not? I'd be interested in what you might think about that. And then, of course, the last part. So those are five things, and I'm sure there are a whole lot of other things people might like to add. But I'll just summarise that last little paragraph. The goal is to be willing and able to listen deeply, effectively, and naturally in many different circumstances. So it is being, as I said, it's being intentional and disciplined, but I like the fact that it says to be natural. You've got to be who you are in all of this. So I think that's an important thing. And then it said the process is developmental. It is a matter of building a scaffold of skills and practices. Ultimately, as these skills become integrated, the scaffold begins to fall away and deeper listening follows naturally. So those are my kind of highlights of that little article with a few questions there. I guess perhaps it's really looking at that in terms of our particular pastoral context and what might be positive or helpful for us as part of the telephone tree and the particular challenges we have in being good listeners, and perhaps also thinking about what the barriers are as well. All right, so I don't know, Hugh, whether you want, how you want to do the discussion. I mean, people might just like to raise their hand if they want to respond to that generally, or raise particular questions.
Well, thank you, Father Greg. That's really brought that paper to life, and I think is very pertinent to our task in listening on the telephone tree. I forgot to mention at the beginning, but I had been recording with Father Greg's agreement. We spoke earlier. I've been recording Father Greg's talk, but I will just turn that off now so that we can move into a time